Hi, and welcome to What's New with Lean Startup, your go-to source for the latest insights and practical strategies for transforming how your company builds new products and services. I'm Ben Hafele, CEO here at the Lean Startup Company, and in this series, we dive deep into the Lean Startup, exploring how to apply it effectively in today's dynamic business landscape. In each episode, we'll break down crucial concepts, share real-world examples, and provide actionable advice. So whether you're a product leader, a corporate innovator, or a technology executive, you'll find valuable takeaways in every episode. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to our channel for more expert insights. Don't forget to like, share, and leave a comment below, and we'd love to hear from you and answer your questions.
Hello, welcome to another episode of What's New with Lean Startup. I'm Jonathan Bertfield, and with me I've got Ben Hafele, and we're going to have a conversation today that's really focused on the methods, right? So we've talked about this all the way through. We've talked about, hey, we're going to get to the methods, and it's central to how many people think about Lean Startup. We've obviously been talking about how there's a framework around the methods, but this is central to what Lean Startup is all about. So we're going to unpack it. We're going to talk about how it's evolved over the years from the contributions of thought leaders in the space, from the original work that was done by Eric and by the influence of all the initiatives we've worked with teams on. And so what we'll see is just some tweaks, some evolution, some new language, and that really gets us to a place where the methods are starting to work in service of teams and really pushing initiatives through really quickly. So, Ben, you want to just frame up any more about methods for us?
Yeah. So in this series of YouTube videos, we start off with a general overview of the full Lean Startup framework, which we're looking at on screen right now. And since then, we've done, some episodes on teams, who does the work. We've done an episode on governance, who makes investment decisions, and then milestones. How do we measure progress through the framework? And now we're getting into what most people know about Lean Startup, which is what are we asking those teams to do actually in order to achieve those milestones, and what's the work that the governing body is holding those teams accountable for doing. And so we'll get right into that. And the foundation of that, of course, is build, measure, learn. So Jonathan, when you think about build, measure, learn, and maybe some of the common misinterpretations or confusion that's out there, what comes to mind?
Yeah. So build, measure, learn is really focused on giving structure to moving fast and iterating based on learnings, right? And so it's a snappy title that is easy to say, and the hard part really is moving with the appropriate velocity to get through as many loops of the building, measuring, and learning as possible. So speed is implied, right? It's just not always acted on.
And just not to cut you off there, but I mean, the number of companies that have kind of lean startup washed, right, their process, and they say, oh yeah, we do build, measure, learn. First we build, and then we measure, and then we learn, and it takes 4 years, and the build phase is 3 years, and it's like, no, that's not what it is. It's about shorter learning cycle time. So I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah, I mean, no, it's totally a misconception that it defines the entire workflow from birth of an idea through. It's one loop of activity, and it's not. When we visualize it at each of those milestones that we've talked about in the previous episode, we've gone through many build, measure, learn loops by the time we get to the milestone. Right. And each of those loops adds to our learning. Each of those loops adds to the body of evidence that we're presenting as part of our recommendation to the governance body. And so we're trying to move as quickly as possible while also making sure that we're focused on learning. Right. We're making sure that we've done just enough learning to really give us confidence moving forward without exhausting the team and without taking too long to get to that decision. Is there something that we actually want to pursue here? Is there some traction as demonstrated by the evidence?
Yeah, and we've alluded to this in several of the episodes in this series, but the whole point of this entire framework is to buy down risk, is to systematically vet, shape, and de-risk new initiatives, whether those are new businesses, new products, new features on existing products, new technology ideas, whatever they are, whatever those initiatives are that you're pushing through the framework. So let's hop right into then to build, measure, learn. Um, I think one of the things that we've seen over and over again is teams kind of starting with build, which is logical because it's called build, measure, learn. We've actually had a lot of our clients say, "Why don't you just rename the darn thing to learn, build, measure?" And that way it would prevent confusion. It's like, well, we'd love to, but that's a really common term out there, and we don't want to try to re-educate the world, right? But really, in practice, it's operated as learn, build, measure. So learn is, what do we want to learn? What do we need to learn right now? What's the most critical thing for us to learn right now? Build is, what's the most minimal yet still viable way of getting at what we need to learn right now? And then measure is actually running whatever we're doing to come back and say, did we learn what we needed to learn? And what do we need to learn next? So that's really the essence of how you operate the loop. Learn, build, measure.
Yeah, and I think the subtlety is that that flow actually drives itself after a while, right? Because the first day that a team comes together and is starting to think about what is this initiative, how can we start building down risk, they have to, if they're operating effectively, have to start saying, well, what do we need to learn? What's the most important thing for us to learn today? Okay, now we can start thinking about how we might test that, how we might validate it with customers, what might we measure, right? So that it kind of provides momentum to our next loop around, because that brings us back from having built an experiment, from having gathered data. We then can synthesize some learnings. Okay, now we know what we're going to do next. And so there's a momentum that's built up by moving through the loop really quickly and enabling teams to focus their activity not just on a general sense of, well, what should we build? The what should we build is informed by what we just previously learned in our last go around the loop, right? So for me, what's new from how we started thinking about this is we want to maximize the number of those loops. We want to inject that cycle as quickly and as regularly all the way through the journey, right? So we start out by thinking, what do we need to know about our customers? But at some point, hopefully pretty quickly, we're asking ourselves, well, what do we know about our go-to-market strategy? And what do we need to learn? And then what do you know about our growth plan? So the focus changes, but the dynamic of moving through that cycle as quickly as possible, that's present all the way through.
Yeah. And just a shout out to, the previous episode in this series, which was milestones. Every single initiative doesn't need to go through every milestone. So you don't have to run experiments of all different types just to do it. It's, what do we need to learn next? And then what's the most efficient experiment that we could build? Actually, the most minimal yet still viable experiment that we could build to test, the assumptions that we need to test next. And I think I just used the word assumptions, which we haven't defined yet. So my bad.
No, we'll get to that. But, there's one other point which I think we're both alluding to, right? Which is the speed. And, I think about it as the build, measure, learn loop forces us to take a beat, right? It forces us to say, yeah, we have confidence in our own team. We have confidence in our own knowledge, right? And so we could make a decision to just go ahead and build something. But if we inject the discipline of build, measure, learn into our activity, it forces us to say, okay, let's take a breath, right? Before we start building, do we actually know what we're going to build? And do we understand all of the risks? And do we all understand all of the challenges? And that can then give us confidence to move really quickly. So it's a way of introducing discipline into the instincts, which are, let's build something, let's get it out there.
So also the nature of build, measure, learn requires that we change the definition of success for a team that's running build, measure, learn. So in a lot of cases, when we go to big companies, small companies, startups, the definition of success is, does the team build the thing they were told to build the way that they were told to build it? And so that's more about outputs, alluding back to one of our previous conversations in a previous episode. And really, when you're running build, measure, learn, if the definition of success isn't we need to make the right recommendation on what to build in the first place and then build the right thing, or we need to recommend that we don't build it at all because there's no evidence that we should. If that's not the definition of success, then teams aren't going to run, build, measure, learn because it's just a waste of time. Because you're producing evidence that no one listens to, and they're like, just go build the thing we told you to build. And unfortunately, we've seen that at some client companies, right? So just wanted to, pull that thread that, like we said before, the method isn't just something you can design on its own. You also have to think about milestones and governance and culture, which is what we're going to talk about, in an episode or two, and that's going to be fun. But all these things are interconnected.
Yeah, and I said something a moment ago, and I just want to back it up by what you've just mentioned, which is how build, measure, learn provides discipline, right? So it provides discipline for the teams. That's sort of what I was mentioning, right? It gives them a focus. Like, what should we build? Well, let's make sure we're building something in service of learning. What it also does is it provides um, a cue for leadership, because when they understand that build, measure, learn is in operation, and a team is coming and talking about whatever their definition of success is, right? It gives the leadership who are on the governance body an opportunity to say, well, how do you know that? What did you learn, right? And what did you build and measure in order to learn it, right? And so that starts to build this culture of, if you're going to make a recommendation, if you're going to come and talk about what should happen next, you have to back that up with data, with a body of evidence that's supported by the right kinds of experiments in service of that learning journey. So it's giving both sides of the table in that conversation structure around which they can operate, which they can ask the right questions and provide the right answers. Okay, so we've talked about the dynamic of moving through the build, measure, learn loop as quickly as possible and doing that as many times as possible. One of the primary ingredients into that cycle is, what are the risks, right? What don't we know? And therefore, what are the things that we might want to de-risk now versus put off till later? And, the language that we've been using throughout the lean startup journey is assumptions, right? And our assumptions, essentially, it's just another word for, like, what are our guesses? And when we talk about leap of faith assumptions, we're talking about what are the most important guesses that are in front of us right now. And so we've been working with lots of teams who just struggle a little bit with how to define, how to capture, and how to articulate their assumptions around a particular initiative. I was working with a team in Central America this week, and one of the things that we talked about was, what's the right way to express an assumption, right? How do we do it in a meaningful way that's not just too abstract or too in the weeds, right? I know you help teams when you're coaching them all the time on this. Like, what's your favorite technique for giving teams guidance on that process?
Well, I think that number one is, we talked about milestones in the last episode. So kind of where are we in those milestones? And then let's really kind of let's state our assumptions about the milestone that we think is the next one we need to achieve. And that way we're not just mapping our assumptions about everything, or our best guesses about everything, because that's a little bit overwhelming. So that's a really good and efficient way of saying, okay, let's focus in on either, alluding back to the last episode, customer value, growth, or scale assumptions. So that's number one. I would say number two is, we always recommend starting with "we believe." I think that sounds a little corny and it sounds like dogma. I'm sure there's some other way to start an assumption, but if you start with "we believe," whatever comes next must be stated with some uncertainty in it, because you can't say "we believe in gravity," because that's ridiculous. Of course, you don't have to believe in it; it exists. And so those are two of the most powerful kind of tools right off the bat that come to mind.
Yeah, it is contrived, but it just directs the discipline again of how to start writing it, right? Because we're not just making a statement in the abstract. We're always thinking about what is the expected behavior of the customer that we're trying to build and solve for, right? And so it just tightens up the focus, right? It's not really a trick, right? It's a good constraint to force the teams to be thinking about the right things as they're capturing their assumptions.
And I think another kind of best practice, and this isn't always true, but making the assumptions about the customer. By the way, the customer could be an internal customer, an intermediate customer, the end customer. I'm using customer in a very general sense. So, um, and even if we're making assumptions about our product or our solution, writing assumptions about how we think our customers will react or interact with our product or solution, that's good because it's more measurable as opposed to we believe our product's going to be great. Okay, well, what's the customer behavior that would indicate that it's great? Let's make an assumption about that. Let's write down an assumption about that and test it.
Yeah. You just said something which triggered a memory for me again from a coaching session recently, which was the inclination, right, is to start writing the assumptions about our product. Like, we believe our feature, our product, our business will do X for the customer. And one of the tips that I was pushing a team, it's fairly early in their journey, right? But they're getting the concepts, they're getting the dynamic of identifying assumptions. I was saying, try and write it without using any language that describes the solution, right? Just talk about what is the outcome you expect to see, what is the expected interaction with the experience, right? So, they used something which was basically along the lines of intelligent, integrated, real-time inventory tracking. And I was like, what does that even mean? Right. So sometimes the role of a coach is great because you can play like the least knowledgeable person about the domain. Right. But you can also say it from the perspective of the customer. Would the customer use that language? Is that what they want? Or is there some value that we're trying to understand? Would they appreciate about? Would they see it as a valuable problem to be solved? What impact would that have for them? Talk about it with the real language of the real humans we're trying to build for.
So when it comes to, and again, we're kind of talking about the learn bit of build, measure, learn. And we're talking about assumptions, which is really at the heart of what do we need to learn next. Another way of stating that more precisely is which assumptions do we need to validate or invalidate next? Which assumptions do we need to test next? And so we've already talked about a couple tips and tricks like which milestone are we at, and stating them about the customer. Another one is just using an assumption map, which is, I'll just be honest, as a lean startup nerd, it's my favorite tool still because it just drives so much great discussion and debate, and it really helps, especially in a workshop setting, teams to really drive and flesh out the uncertainty and prioritize it. So I would say the two axes that we've kind of like standardized on, and sometimes we'll use different variations, but this is the one that's our standard, is thinking about one axis, which is, how important is this to this initiative's success? So, if this is wrong, basically, how detrimental is that? If this is wrong, and it's like, okay, like we can still, we're still kind of pretty much on track with what we're thinking, then it's not that important to project success. But also, if it's really detrimental and it's underpinning the whole thing, it's like taking the rug out from underneath the initiative, then it's high importance. The other axis is degree of certainty or degree of uncertainty, right? Sometimes we state it differently, but the idea being, how much knowledge do we have? How much evidence do we have that this assumption is true? Do we have a lot of evidence or do we have not very much evidence? And so our standard is degree of uncertainty, um, which is, when you put that on a 2 by 2 matrix, you get importance to project success on the vertical and then degree of uncertainty on the bottom. So the top right ones are the ones that are the most important, that we are the most uncertain about. And those are what we call the leap of faith assumptions.
And that's an evolution, right? Because in the original framework, what was on those axes was there was a dimension which was timing, right? It's like, when should we test this assumption, right? And what I found teams struggled with that dimension is that they don't know. They don't know enough about what they're trying to learn to be able to give it that label. This is something we need to test now. And that's one of the reasons why the order through the milestones has played a big role in influencing the assumptions, because what we're focused on right now is what's the next milestone we need to get through. So if we're thinking about the customer hypothesis, right, we're trying to understand whether we really have built down the risk of who the customer is, then all the assumptions that we need to focus on at that point are about the customer. We believe our customer has these characteristics. We believe which of our customers is going to be an early adopter. We believe that we understand the impact it's going to have. It's all about understanding the customer and exposing that risk. So we don't need to think about timing as much, because we've kind of excluded all of the assumptions that might come later around, will the customer use the solution? Can we get organic growth? All of those things, we don't need to think about them, because right now we're just thinking about the custom hypothesis. And then as we move forward, we can exclude a lot of the custom hypotheses because we've moved past that and validated it. So they move over to the left on the 2x2 because we've got a lot of knowledge about them. So I think the play here between a journey that teams are going on being really explicit has helped evolve how we map assumptions and therefore how we prioritize what needs to be tested.
Yeah. And it's been a great journey. And like I alluded to earlier, it's such a hit in the workshops that we do, because a lot of people think, I think we've already got this nailed. I remember one specific workshop with a company that will remain nameless to protect the guilty, where I had 5 engineers, and they all came together and they said, "This is stupid. We don't need to do assumption mapping. We know what to do here. We know what we know. We don't. There is no uncertainty." And I said, "Great. Then this is going to be a 15-minute exercise, and we'll move on." And they were all certain about almost exactly the opposite thing. So their assumptions were kind of so different from each other that it was, 2.5 hours later, they were still arguing with each other about what was known, what wasn't known. And it just drew out all this uncertainty. And it was great because then we could go address it in the build phase.
Yeah, and everything you just said, it's one of the powers of the moment in the build, measure, learn loop, but also the tool of assumption mapping, because it forces alignment with the team. You have to express what's in your head. You have to capture it on Post-it notes or on a digital whiteboard or wherever you're doing it, right? It forces you as an individual contributor on the team, and then you as a team, to get alignment around, yes, we agree that these 4, 5, whatever assumptions are the most important, therefore worthy of being included in the build, right? So that alignment then allows us to move much quicker, right? Because we don't start building something and then we've got disagreement. Well, why are we even building that thing? It's known or it's unknown, right? Like we've come to a conclusion about that, and therefore that powers our movement through the build, measure, learn loop much faster.
Yep. So speaking of which, I think we've covered kind of what's new in the learn part of build, measure, learn. Let's head over to build. And so I always like to kick off a discussion about build with getting really precise about what we're building, because there's a lot of confusion there. And what we're doing is we're building the most minimal and yet still viable experiment, which may or may not be the product, in order to test those assumptions, those leap of faith assumptions that we identified and learn. And the number of companies that just see build, measure, learn, and they think, okay, we're going to build pretty much the whole thing, and then we're going to measure and learn from it. That's not the essence of build, measure, learn. So when we're building the best experiment to test those leap of faith assumptions. Super critical point.
Yeah, it's super important. You didn't actually express the acronym there, but more often than not, what trips people up in this stage is that they think what we need to build is an MVP, right? And there are so many definitions of the MVP that have been essentially bastardized versions of, right? Because what people end up saying is, well, what's the crappiest version of the product we can build to get out into the market? That will be the testing cycle for us. And, sometimes it's a hard conversation because we're like, well, actually, that's not the intention of the acronym. So if you want to do that, that's great, but let's not confuse ourselves by calling it an MVP because it's not the most minimal thing. We could do many, many things to learn what we need to learn before we actually go ahead and start creating a V1 of the product, before we start writing code and building interfaces and marketing and, deploying with customers. What could we have learned earlier that gives us the confidence to move forward? Hi everyone, Jonathan Bertfield here from Lean Startup Company. Thanks for listening to this episode of What's New with the Lean Startup. If you're a product leader developing solutions in an agile environment and you're eager to inject customer centricity into everything you build, we'd love to have you join us for a 2-hour online workshop. In the workshop, we'll cover how to identify and frame validated customer problems that your product can solve for, how to define MVPs and develop hypotheses, and the relevant metrics to test them. In short, you'll gain actionable insights into how to integrate the mechanics of customer centricity into your product development process. We'll do all of this with hands-on exercises and real-world case studies. If you're interested in attending one of these workshops, register using the link in the show notes so we can send you dates for our upcoming sessions. I hope to see you there. All right, let's get back to the show.
I love it. So I want to come back to MVP because it drives so much confusion and delay, right? Another innovation in the build phase is the kind of 3 design elements of an experiment. So what's the most minimally yet still viable experiment? Well, what is an experiment exactly? And so I thought I was running experiments at Caterpillar, and then actually I hired Lean Startup Company to come in, and Marilyn, who's still on our team today, now and still works at Lean Startup Company, said, all right, let me see what the last experiment you ran. And I showed her, and she's like, that's not an experiment. And I'm like, you're right. It's not. Right. And so it wasn't just, nominally an experiment. It just didn't capture the essence of build, measure, learn. So, what are the design elements, of an experiment, Jonathan?
Well, before we answer that, tell us what was so wrong with the work that you were doing that you'd called an experiment. Like, unpack it a little bit.
Sure. So many things. Number one is we didn't have explicitly stated assumptions. So at the beginning of an experiment, you should be able to say, which assumptions are you testing? And they start with we believe, and oftentimes they're in a bullet list. Here's what we're testing. We didn't have that. We were just going to go learn stuff about things by talking to people, and it wasn't a tightly defined experiment. We didn't have a crisp if-then statement that said, if we do this thing, then customers are going to say or do that thing. It just wasn't defined, and that was really tripping us up because, before that intervention from Maryland, we were just kind of go out and we're like, yeah, we're learning a lot. And I guess we were in a general sense, but it wasn't scientific, it wasn't precise, and we couldn't say exactly what we learned at any one time, which was back to the governance model, really annoying to the executives who were like, what are you guys doing over there? Are you like, you're learning a lot? Great. Like, that doesn't pay the bills. Like, tell me, how close are we to revenue? Like, where are we getting to? And so, just being really precise about what an experiment was and what we were testing.
Yeah, no, that's such a common fail point that it's pretty easy to correct, right? Because we can start to frame up the work with some pretty simple tools, right? So one of the things that's evolved for us over the years in terms of how we describe experiments, to your point about like the why we trying to learn this, right? The language that we've really focused on has been like, what's our call to action? Let's use that as a driving point because that allows us to say in a pretty clear way, if we see this response, right, then we will have learned the thing we're trying to learn, right? So we start by framing that up. I mean, it's very explicit in the build, measure, learn loop. What enters us into the build phase is we're trying to learn something. Okay, so how are we going to learn it? We're going to learn it by seeing a certain behavior that we can make the customer make a choice about, like give them a binary moment of opportunity. Do they do the thing that we hope they would do or not, right? That's really a clear moment of pushing them towards that call to action.
Yeah. So I love that. And actually, in a lot of cases, it's like, here's what we're trying to learn. Start with the call to action. Like, what do we want? And well, maybe we can cover the strength of evidence curve in just a couple of minutes. But are we asking people to just tell us something, or are we asking them to actually do something that's a leading indicator of a sale? That's a little bit stronger evidence than just them saying something. I'm going to park that for a minute. So then we can say, okay, what instrument do we need? The instrument is the thing that we're applying to the human in order to get them to take that call to action or not. And so an instrument could be a discussion guide. It could be a sketch prototype. It could be some marketing material. It could be anything. There's an infinite number of instruments out there, some of which are called minimum viable products, by the way, but not all, right? So an observation guide is an instrument. We're applying an observation guide to target humans in order to find out what they do. And so an instrument is another one of those kind of experiment design elements. So now we've got instruments and calls to action, and I'll just lob the other one up there, which is the experiment channel, which is how is the instrument going to get to the customer to see whether they take the call to action or not. And so the three experiment design elements that we've kind of standardized on are instrument, channel, experiment channel specifically, and call to action. And when we really break down an experiment in that way, despite all the other literature and great books and everything that are out there, it really simplifies and makes a very efficient way of designing an experiment, because you can kind of flip through all the instruments you've used before, seeing the channels. Is it email? Is it in person? Is it social media? And then the calls to action. Is it we're going to ask them to say something. They're going to fill out a survey. They're going to be a candidate in the pilot program. They're going to pre-register, whatever it is. So those are the three that are really a big innovation and have been super helpful in our work with clients.
Yeah, and what they do, those three elements, is again, I keep using the word discipline, and I'm not sure how comfortable I am with that, but I think
I
it's
like it.
right.
It's a disciplined approach to entrepreneurship.
Yeah, because it gives the team structure, right? So one of the things that's involved in building the right experiment is understanding what's the wrong experiment. So we often talk about it as the step before kind of getting into the detailed definition of what the experiment is going to be is coming up with a whole bunch of different ideas around the potential experiment. So an experiment brainstorm in order to identify, well, which of these is stronger, which of these is weaker, which one really kind of jumps out, both in terms of how quickly we can move and how strong the data is that we're going to get back. And so the tools that we're talking about, where we've got a whole palette of potential instruments, a whole palette of potential channels, and a whole palette of calls to action, the combination of box one, box two, box three within that structure really gives us a creative environment that we can start to recognize there isn't only one way to learn this particular key gap in our knowledge right now. There are many ways, and let's open ourselves up. Let's diverge from our thinking so that we can identify the best experiment that will allow us to move through the build, measure, learn loop as quickly as possible.
And once you share that knowledge with teams, I mean, we were up in Detroit a while back doing a workshop with a big company up there, and we had teams kind of designing experiments. It was part of a 2-day boot camp, and this was the end of day one because we were going to run experiments on day two. And there's one team that was just stuck, right? And they're like, okay, instrument, channel, call to action, like, and they were just wrestling, and they had a lot of ideas, and they didn't know. And then, and it was particularly thorny because this is like a product that was going to come out in a little bit, but they couldn't really sell it, and there's all these regulatory issues. And so, like with like 60 seconds left in regulation, one of the team members that was working is like, I got it. We're like, tell us, what is it? And she said, the call to action is, will they sign the terms and conditions that would be in the contract that they'd have to sign, they'd have to agree to anyway if they were eventually going to buy it, but would they sign those terms and conditions for this new vehicle that they were looking at building? And so it's like, oh, great. So then the instrument got really clear. It's like, hey, here's this new vehicle. And it was an in-person experiment at this customer event. And then the call to action was, hey, if you're interested in this and you want to kind of pre-register to get one, would you sign the terms and conditions? And it's like, you would agree to those any day, but now you're like setting something up for them to do that they have to think about. And it was just a great example of that wasn't like, a call to action that was in a list that they picked from. They just creatively came up with that and it was fantastic. And by the way, it really worked in practice.
Yeah. Well, there's two elements to what you just described in that example, right? So, for me, the first one is there's a general philosophy in the experiment design process that we're again combining with another element of the framework, which is the milestones, right? And so, early in those milestones, the types of experiments we are capable of running, right, and we want to run are really more about what will the customer say, right? So interviews, sometimes surveys, sometimes their responses to kind of more formal interactions with customers. We're looking for say data, right? What is an opinion of the customer about what their future behavior might be? And early on, that's really important because it gives us some guidance. It helps us understand what's going on in their heads. We can probe more deeply into their thinking. You said you would do this. Tell me why. Some of those solution interview moments or on problem interview, where we're saying, you know, give me an example of, right? We need to have those conversations, and they're really important. Later on, we're pushing much more towards what do they do, right? So we're moving from that prediction of future behavior to an observation of it. So that example you just gave of will they sign about the terms and conditions, that's like a much bigger ask than saying to them, would you sign the terms and conditions? You give them the terms and conditions and say, okay, like, what do you do with it?
It's so true. And the temptation is, hey, we showed you this, like some marketing material for this vehicle. Tell us how you like it on a scale of 1 to 10. It's like, okay, that's a call to action, right? I mean, or tell us if you like it or not. That's a call to action. But to your point, it's not a very high strength of evidence call to action. But hey, I need you to sign these terms and conditions, and then you'll be one of the first people that that will offer this product to if you sign. That has a little bit of weight to it, right? And so that's when they have to put some skin in the game. There's more of an exchange of value, and so that's when you have a higher strength of evidence. So we should probably talk about the strength of evidence curve.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. It's a good segue into it, which is, so the continuum here is moving from a prediction, commentary to observation, right? And so, right at the beginning of that journey is, what do you think? Would you buy it? What would you pay? Right. Which is, interesting to hear, but it's like, I don't know. I don't know what this thing is yet. Right. So how am I going to give you an indication of what I would pay in 3 years time when, etc. Right. It's, it's useful. It's just shallow in terms of the reaction we can have to it. And again, that's okay because the response that we're going to do, the actions we're going to take as a team is, all right, we're going to run the next experiment, or we're going to build a slightly more high fidelity instance of, right? Later on, when we're making a decision, do we go to market with this thing? Do we actually build our first version? Do we deploy this into the customer's hands without us being there? We can't rely on their prediction data because that's just giving ourselves, the risk that we didn't ask the question quite right, or they didn't know, or they lied to us. So as we move through the milestones, we're really moving a progression of the types of evidence and the weight of that evidence that can emerge.
Yeah, and I think so basically the strength of evidence curve, which many of the listeners to this episode will have heard of before. It's pretty different from our perspective, and so like you said, the horizontal axis is what people say versus what people are willing to do. Strength of evidence is the vertical axis, but really the strength of evidence is driven by the call to action. And there's been a lot of, previous work where it was like, no, it's the type of experiments, right? So if we simulate this experiment and the customer is using it, and we're running around behind the scenes doing a Wizard of Oz experiment, then that's a really high strength of evidence experiment. It's like not necessarily. What if you just after all that you say to the customer, "Did you like it?" Then that's really low strength of evidence because it's just what people say. Now, on the other hand, if you do that big Wizard of Oz experiment, and then at the end you're like, hey, pre-register now or buy now or enter your credit card, whatever it is, that's really high strength of evidence. But it's not a function of the type of experiment, it's a function of the call to action. And yes, in order to ask for certain calls to action, you have to have a little bit of a different experiment or more high fidelity prototype or MVP or whatever you want to call it, right? But really it's about the call to action. And so, a sale, did they buy, is at the far right end of the curve. That's really high strength of evidence because you don't need any more evidence. They just bought it. On the far left is, did they what did they say? Um, and then there's an infinite number of calls to action they're going from connecting those 2 points. One of which is signing the terms and conditions, which like we didn't even know about that until she came up with it at that at that workshop, right? But some of it is sign up for our newsletter. I really like, if you want to learn more about this, meet with us on Friday at 4 p.m. I love that one because it's like if you're going to show up on Friday at 4 p.m., for a meeting to learn more, you're probably pretty interested. I also really like sign up to be a candidate for the pilot program. Or, I mean, there's just so many calls to action in between. And so it's exciting and it's fun to design those as a function of what you're trying to learn next.
And two elements of that that I find really important when I'm working with teams. So one is what's the domain that we're working in, right? So the different calls to action are high variance if we're talking about B2C, right? We're asking consumers to interact with, and we're asking them to take a next step, as opposed to when we're doing B2B and we're talking about a corporate process, we're talking about procurement, we're talking about different players who have different capacity to respond, right? So we would never ask a consumer in terms of an experiment, we would never put in front of them a call to action, which is, will you sign a letter of intent, right? Right. It doesn't make any sense, right? But it's a really powerful call to action to test out in a B2B environment because it's much different than them expressing enthusiasm. It's much different than them participating in a workshop. It's like, okay, we're going to expose our organization to this product, make a commitment, right? We haven't yet bought it. We haven't yet kind of really integrated it, but we're making a commitment that is real and concrete. And so that's pushing much more towards the high strength of evidence rather than just the expression of excitement. And so we want to tune both kind of where we are in the journey. We want to tune the experiment to where we are in the journey, and we want to tune it to the operational space that we're in. So are we dealing with consumers? Are we dealing with businesses? That gives the teams a lot of structure to operate in because they can get creative, they can start thinking about different ways to stimulate those calls to action, but they know kind of what's coming next along that journey.
Yeah. And just one more thing to add on that space is that sometimes when we talk about the strength of evidence curve, even with teams in workshops, right, they'll say, oh, so we shouldn't do interviews. No, no, no. Like it is lower strength of evidence, but it's a great place to start for all the reasons that you just mentioned, Jonathan. You can test more LOFAs, more leap of faith assumptions in an interview than in some kind of unmoderated experiment where we're just testing a couple key assumptions. And you can probe for understanding. You can ask why. It's just low strength of evidence. So shout out to Marissa Homan, our previous colleague. Right, she coined a great phrase, which is interviews are a great place to start, but a bad place to end. And so it's like, yeah, start with interviews, but then go up the curve. Right, like don't just stop there, because if you're just relying on what people say, you're setting yourself up for a lot of risk of failure.
Yeah. And I'll add one final point, right, which is again about the discipline, about the experiment design. What that does to a team when they realize there's a journey of different experiments that they're going to run because we're driving different calls to action that change over time. It forces a recognition of the fact that there is no one MVP, right? There is no one minimum viable product. We have to build that and then we're done, right? What it says, maybe this is a little bit too conceptual, but it says that the approach of using MVPs is a state of mind rather than a thing, right? Because it says we're continuously going to generate these instruments that are going to drive our learning, and the level of minimal changes over time. Early on, it's a questionnaire. Later on, it's actually a working product that's deployed in the hands of customers without us being there. Those both can be MVPs because it's the least we need to learn at that point. And we had to write some code. We had to build a sellable product in order for us to learn what we need to learn, right? So we've given the freedom to the team to explore different ways of learning while still maintaining the mindset of let's not do too much. Let's keep it minimal and let's learn just what we need to learn at this moment.
To just coming back to, the MVP, just to set the record straight. An MVP is the most minimal yet still viable experiment that we can run in order to test the loafahs that we need to test next. And so we're starting to blend together a lot here, right? It's like, which milestone are we in? And that determines what kinds of assumptions we're testing, and then we prioritize them on the assumption map to find out which one of the leap of faith assumptions. So we're not just running experiments on anything; we're running experiments on precisely what we need to learn next. And just to bring in the three design elements for an experiment: instrument, channel, and call to action. Um, some some instruments are MVPs, but all MVPs are instruments, meaning an MVP is one type of instrument where we're saying it's some early representation of our product that we're using in order to learn what we need to learn now. So to your point, Jonathan, a lot of teams start with a sketch prototype, literally 8.5 by 11 piece of copy paper written in pencil. That's an MVP. It's an instrument. It's an early representation of our offering that we're applying to humans to get them to take a call to action. And then there might be a more serious mock-up, or then there's a low code, barely working prototype, or there's a and so to just emphasize your point, there is no one MVP. It's a series of instruments that it's different for every team. The path is different for every team because the instrument is specifically designed to test what we need to test next. So hopefully we've set the record straight. I'm sure everyone in the world is going to listen to this, and so everyone's going to be 100% clear on what an MVP is.
Yeah. I'm gonna add one minor point, right? I know we're running out of time here, right? But one of the new innovations that we have at our disposal is vibe coding, right? We can go from an idea to a working prototype of that idea super fast, right? And it's incredibly powerful, and there's tons of tools that are out there. The danger is that we skip all the steps which help us understand what should be in that. And now we kind of can. We can skip all of those steps because we're not wasting a huge amount of resources, right? And so there's a tension here, right? If we can build something that is a guess without foundation on what the call to actions might have been prior to this, right? And we can put it in the hands of customers, is that the most minimal thing because it took us 10 minutes and we used AI and we developed something? Or do we need to go through the previous step that really are the ingredients to the prompts that we're putting in to the AI tool, right? And we're going to work out the answers to that. It's still so early days in the approach of vibe coding where we're doing no-code tools and AI-driven experiences. But that feels like the next lesson that we really need to learn. How do we use that new generation of tools in response to the mindset that we're really pushing?
That's a great add-on. We're helping our clients to use AI to generate those instruments instantaneously, as opposed to, hey, we need to wait for a month because so-and-so, the design people need to do this. And so it's certainly accelerating the build, measure, learn loop back to our job is to shorten learning cycle time as much as possible. Um, so you mentioned we're about to run out of time. I guess we should talk about measure, right? So we've talked about learn, we've talked about build. Let's talk about measure. What are some of the things people mess up in measure, or some of the new innovations that you're seeing, Jonathan?
Yeah, so I mean, we've touched on it because we crossed over in terms of we're measuring the response to the call to action, right? And so one of the key definitions in our experiment process is, did they do the thing or not? Was it measurable? Like, can we see that behavioral pattern, right? And one of the key dynamics that we see with teams who are early in their journey is that they don't really think through what would success look like, right? What might be the metric from engagement with this call to action, using this instrument through this channel? what does success look like? And how can we declare that up front? So we always want to make sure that when we're designing an experiment, we're picking our success metrics and we're holding ourselves accountable to it. And that can be the number of moments of interaction with an element of the instrument. It can be the choices that a customer are making, right? But we always want to state, declare, and articulate really clearly what does good look like when customers engage with this experience.
Classic. Because if you're doing learn, build, measure, and you haven't precisely defined what you're going to measure in the build, in the build portion, then you get to measure, and everyone's like, "Well, I don't know. What do we do? Do we take notes? What do we count? Do we record interviews and that's it? What do we put in Excel?" And so, absolutely right. I think a lot of the success of the measure, of the measure piece of learn, build, measure is planning appropriately and just taking a minute to plan appropriately in build.
Yeah, and you're so right about that reaction because it's super easy with a vague set of success metrics when we're trying to measure like success of our call to action. Right? It's super easy for the team to say, "Yeah, I feel really good about that." Right, and we can each have a different point of view on what we feel good about. It's much clearer if we've set a did they do or did they not do as our target, and we've got a clarity on what good looks like. We need to see 4 out of the 10 customers who are engaging with do the thing or not, right? So if we get two, doesn't matter how good we feel and how enthused the customers were, right? We didn't meet our target. Does that mean that we can't move forward? Maybe, maybe not, right? But we need to have a really deliberate way of responding to what did we observe in terms of the behavior of customers we were trying to learn from.
Yeah. And I think this is the right episode to mention this in. Again, all these things bleed into each other so much. But I think, one of the things that I think is really important to mention here is when we've set that, you mentioned 4 out of 10 customers are going to take this call to action. Um, in a lot of cases, the most successful experiments are where 0 out of 10 took that call to action. But we've figured out why. And so teams are always reluctant to set that criteria, and they're like, "Well, maybe we should sandbag the criteria a little bit so that we can say we won, basically, or we were successful." And like, that's not the definition of success. The definition of success is, here's what good looks like. If 4 out of 10 or more take the call to action, then we'd be comfortable going to a venture capitalist or a senior executive or whoever it is, right, that's in that governing seat to say, "Hey, we feel good about this because we hit this criteria." If you don't hit it, it's not your fault, right? It's the opportunity itself. And the real question is, what did you learn about it? And so some of the most successful experiments, nobody took the call to action, but they didn't take the call to action for exactly the same reason. All 10 didn't take the call to action because, just as an example, your product didn't have feature X. So then the next experiment, what do? You add feature X, and then you find out what happens. So just because you don't hit that criteria doesn't mean the world is over. It just means, okay, what did we learn and what do we do next?
Yeah. Yeah. And again, the discipline of the process demands that when a team comes to a conclusion, they can present a body of evidence. And if that evidence is feelings, is enthusiasm, is emotion, right? That's a much harder conversation to have than when you've got really clear data. We said 4 out of 10 was our target. We did 6 different experiments using that criteria, and it evolved over time, the types of experiments. We kept on seeing failure point. We kept on seeing failure point. Therefore, we can make a stronger case for declaring, let's not pursue this. We've invalidated all our assumptions, and we got a clear trend. We've spoken to 60, 70 people now across this group of experiments, and we keep seeing the same invalidation of our assumptions. Therefore, we've got real confidence in our recommendation.
So one more thing to mention in kind of the measure piece of learn, build, measure is to really, as the team, you know, executes the experiment that was designed and build, it's, are we actually implementing the experiment as designed? So for example, if you're doing a lower strength of evidence experiment like interviews, we said we were going to talk to 10 chief data officers or 10 senior electrical engineers or 10 whoever. Are we are we talking to the right people, or are we just talking to anybody at the target company that has a pulse? Right. Well, we were supposed to talk to somebody at Xerox, a chief data officer at Xerox, but we talked to somebody in sales. Okay, well, that doesn't meet the criteria. You're not actually executing the experiment that you built. So it's really important to reflect in measure: are we actually executing the experiment that we designed or not?
Yeah, I love it. Um, I think we could go on for a really long time, so we may have to do a whole nother episode on methods, methods part two. The other thing I'll ask for those of you who are listening, if you've got a question about the practices that you've been using or challenges you have in using the methods, leave a comment underneath this episode, and we'll try and cover it in future episodes. But this has been a great conversation, Ben. So look forward to our next one, and have a great day.
Thanks, Jonathan. That wraps up another episode of What's New with Lean Startup. This series is brought to you by the Lean Startup Company, where we help companies transform how they build new products and businesses. You can find out more about us and how we serve our clients at www.leanstartup.co. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to our channel for more expert insights. Don't forget to like, share, and leave a comment below, and we'd love to hear from you and answer any questions you may have. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you in the next episode.